Once again, we welcome you back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We're happy to welcome Sam Raus back to the program. Sam, for those who are meeting you for the first time, take a moment here. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Miami, just about a week and a half ago. And I am particularly focused here at Young Voices as a contributor on foreign affairs, tech policy, financial policy, and general economic and cultural election things. I'm from originally outside of Philadelphia.
Well, first of all, let me congratulate you on graduating. That's a milestone and worthy of a round of applause. I also was very intrigued with an article of yours in realclearmarkets.com. Let's not mimic the EU's tech tyranny in the United States. And when I hear tech tyranny in the United States, I tend to think of less of a war against big tech and more of the U.S. government in some ways joining hands with big tech to make sure that unfavorable viewpoints are throttled back and that sort of thing. But can you kind of help me understand when we talk about tech tyranny in this sense, what are we talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very legitimate concern to be had. But what this piece was focusing on is there's been a rise in antitrust litigation in the United States, kind of mimicking the style of similar litigation that's been happening in Europe, that has been championed by this anti-big tech crowd that, claims to be supporting the common person, supporting small businesses, both, in their competitiveness in the marketplace and being able to start new tech startups, as well as supporting individual liberties. The problem with this litigation that's been trying to, claim that all big tech companies are a monopoly, claiming that they're, in cahoots against the United States in some sort of conspiracy, is it's actually costing pension plans thousands and thousands of dollars. And these are pension plans of state and local government employees, not very well paying jobs in the first place, a lot of times part-time jobs, that are mainly held by a lot of middle and working class people. So while they're promising to champion the little man, they're actually costing the little man money, as well as these are very expensive lawsuits, and it leads to, inflation in the prices by these tech companies, inflation in the prices of cell phone plans and things like that, those are everyday costs that are, a big burden on people's pocketbooks. And what we're seeing is kind of a tyranny of virtue signaling in the marketplace is what I like to describe it as.
Now, let's talk a little bit about antitrust. I think I told you as we were getting ready to go on the air, as many times as I hear that term come up, and I kind of think I understand it, but really, if somebody pressed me, well, explain what it is, I would not have a very cogent explanation. So when should antitrust action come into play on the part of the U.S. government?
Yeah, so the long-standing metric of the consumer welfare standard has been that antitrust is meant to preserve competitiveness in the marketplace for the purpose of providing the consumers with best goods at the lowest cost. It's basic capitalist economics. That's how we functioned. And, people, as serious as Adam Smith, Milton Friedman, had championed for there not to be monopolies for this very reason. And that's what antitrust litigation is aimed at, is preventing monopolies. The problem with this is these days, the anti-big tech crowd has championed a new movement. The new Brandeis movement is what it's often referred to as, that is focused much more on these different signals of employment metrics, of minimum wage metrics, of whether or not a company is meeting certain social activist standards being set, that are kind of arbitrary, and they're just not based in economic indicators. They're not based in the prices that everyday consumers are experiencing. They're based in these kind of different numbers that kind of come up in different places, that there isn't a lot of basis to be shown that they are what we should be measuring our economic regulation on, whereas the much more tempered consumer welfare standard is focused on hard economic data that can be generated and compared with.
Can we still rightly call it a free market if we have this kind of legislation or policy in place? Because it sounds like at some point government is stepping in and going, we'll handle this, and telling the free market to step aside.
Yeah, and I think one of the bigger problems is we've continuously demonized these tech companies when, it's pretty obvious in the past several years how much we rely upon them for marketing our businesses, for socializing and communicating with people across the country. I certainly wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for tech companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft. Yet we act like they are, stealing all of our data, which is a legitimate concern about whether or not our data is being accessed by, malpractice and, out to get us. There's no competitiveness when we've seen in the market, in the stock market, that there's been all these new tech startups that are booming and coming up with great innovations, and they're able to leverage the technology of others. And that's really what we need to be supporting is, making sure that people are not limiting, the competitiveness and the marketplace, yet the government seems to be doing just that, kind of through posturing themselves as if they are, working for everyday people.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the European Union, because I don't think they make a whole lot of pretense of free market there. I think they're much more open to no. There has to be regulation. There has to be very
Right.
strict oversight. And you mentioned in your article there's a danger that we may want to drift in that direction. The U.S. government may want to drift in that direction. What's it like when the EU is regulating these tech industries?
Yeah, so the EU has already passed a number of different acts, most prominently focused on AI and concerns with, deep fakes and not labeling it properly. The issue is, I actually got to spend an entire semester in Europe, is there is just not the same kind of economic competitiveness that we see here. There's a real drive behind our free market system in the United States that, sure, at times can be grueling, can require a lot of work, can see businesses fail, but it ultimately prevails in being able to uplift new and innovative things. And, when a problem arises that the consumers are concerned about, other businesses fix that problem. And so the business that, allows deep fakes to be used on a social media platform, well, people might stop using it because they're going to realize that it's a bad platform and they're going to use a better platform. Um, I don't think that's what's going to be the case in the EU, and the EU has already seen a lot of financial struggles because of its hyper-regulation. And really, it's not a place, people don't go there to start a tech startup, do they? They come to the United States, they go to the Silicon Valley, they now go to South Florida a lot, they go to Texas now. So it's not conducive to an environment for growth and development. And that's really what we should be focusing on, I think.
So how do we strike the balance of proper oversight and yet staying out of the way enough that these startup companies in particular actually have room to innovate, grow, and prosper?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the big difference between some people's belief that the government should be getting involved with this, and you see it now on both the far left and far right, versus what we're really talking about here is transparency. And you can ensure companies to have transparency without, you know, browbeating on them with taxes or lawsuits and regulations. You can require information to be disclosed. Labeling a deep fake might be one start. You know whether or not it's a deep fake on the platform. We're not automatically eliminating it. That can be the same said for most other tech companies. And I think that's kind of the balance versus more taxes, more lawsuits, more corporate regulations that cost a whole lot of money that the government doesn't provide any support for you to be able to pay for. That's a problem, and that creates a lot of barriers.
So let's talk for a moment about the responsibility that should be on the consumer. Because, I mean, it's all, I'm grateful. Thank you, government. Thank you, regulatory agencies, for looking out for me. But as a consumer, I should probably bear a pretty fair amount of that responsibility myself, shouldn't I?
Yeah, and I think that we need to re-emphasize focus on individual responsibility and, in research and knowledge. And if the government wants to make sure that that information is easily accessible to everyday people, that's perfectly reasonable. I think that should be done in, the food space, the pharmaceutical space, as well as this space. But it shouldn't be forcing you to make certain decisions. It should be empowering you to be able to make those decisions informed on your own.
I absolutely love the quote that you end up this article with from Milton Friedman. underlying underlying most arguments against the free market is a lack of belief in freedom itself. And I have to ask you this, Sam: is freedom ever going to be fashionable again? Sometimes it feels like it's really out of style.
Well, I think that's hopefully what we're working on here, right?
Yep. I hope it catches on. And again, thanks for your efforts in bringing this to light. Again, we're talking with Sam Raus. Sam, for those who would like to follow your work or perhaps connect up with you on social media, what's the best place to do that?
Sure, you can follow me at Sam Raus1 on Twitter, or you can find me at Sam Raus on LinkedIn.
Raus spelled R-A-U-S. And again, congratulations on your graduation. I hope you have a lot of great opportunities ahead of you.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. We're happy to welcome Jordan McGillis back to the program. Jordan, good to see you once again. For those meeting you for the first time, take a second and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Brian. I am primarily with the Manhattan Institute, where I'm the economics editor of our magazine City Journal, but I've got a side gig with a Taiwan-focused think tank called the Global Taiwan Institute. And my focus there is on energy policy in the Asia Pacific, obviously with Taiwan at the focal point of that, but how Taiwan interacts with the regional players and the US, of course. And I've been focusing on that a lot recently as Taiwan has become a more important issue globally.
Yeah, when I think about one of the more vibrant economies in Asia, Taiwan's got to be up there at the top of the list. I say that simply because I know we depend on them a great deal for things like, computer chips, etc., very high-tech stuff. So talk to me about your article. I'm looking at the headline here. Taiwan's Lei, this is their president-elect, needs to rethink nuclear shutdown plan. And first of all, if I could get a little bit of background on who is the president-elect, and then let's talk about, are they looking at shutting down their nuclear reactors as well?
Yes, they are. Let's start with the politics and work to the present.
Okay.
Lai Ching-te is now the president of Taiwan. He was just sworn in on May 20th. He was elected in January, and he succeeds Tsai Ing-wen, who was the president from the same party. Lai Ching-te was the vice president for the last 8 years. His English name is William Lai. I'll just go with that for the purposes of this conversation. So Tsai Ing-wen became president in 2015, and she instituted a policy of phasing out nuclear energy. There's a long and complicated history of the politics of energy and the environment in Taiwan, and it's really come to a head in the last decade. The party that they represent, Tsai Ing-wen and William Lai, is called the Democratic Progressive Party. And this party got its start in the 1980s, and a big part of their origins was opposing the then in power KMT, who had a pro-nuclear energy policy. So anti-nuclear activism was genuinely at the heart of the political movement that has now become the dominant party in Taiwan. In the 1980s, when the KMT was in power, and that's the party of Chiang Kai-shek, back from the origins of Taiwan as a sovereign and independent state, they built their economy in the 70s and 80s on nuclear. The DPP gets its start opposing that right around the same time, I'll note, as the Chernobyl catastrophe in the Soviet Union. So in the 80s, anti-nuclear activism was seen as being anti-authoritarian. The KMT at that time was indeed a one-party authoritarian entity, but then they transitioned to democracy peacefully, and the KMT and the DPP have vied for power ever since, and they've traded the presidency back and forth a couple of times. This is the first time that one party since democracy began in the 1990s has won 3 straight presidential elections. And nuclear policy has indeed been a key part of that. Tsai Ing-wen, back in 2015, campaigned on what she called a nuclear-free homeland. So again, that is tying back to the roots of her party. And it's just been this long-running thread in Taiwanese politics that the KMT is the party for nuclear, the DPP is the party against nuclear. Now, of course, a lot of other geopolitical considerations are coming to bear. And the fact that the DPP has committed to phasing out nuclear is really causing them some problems. And to the extent that that they face a threat from China, it's just heightened.
Wow. That was actually a very succinct explanation, by the way. I mean, you covered a lot of history in a really short amount of time. Going back to Chernobyl, that was I was working my first radio job when that all happened, and I remember the concerns throughout the world, and I remember distinctly the anti-nuclear sentiment that dominated much of the 1980s. But it seems like there's a pretty good track record. I mean, since that time, notwithstanding that, yep, Chernobyl was a real legit disaster, it seems like nuclear power actually has shown itself to be extremely safe. Am I wrong about that?
The track record is nearly immaculate. You've got this one enormous disaster at Chernobyl, which you and I think would agree was exacerbated by the type of government that was in control at that time and in that place. But there's a very inconvenient fact that in 2011, there was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear meltdown in Japan, just a short distance away from Taiwan. And that meltdown, which has since proven not to be as catastrophic as we feared, we've now learned that we can release the water that had been quarantined back into the Pacific Ocean. But that also played a part in this resurgent focus in Taiwan on nuclear safety. And Tsai Ing-wen saw what happened in Japan and knew that she could capitalize on anti-nuclear fears in Taiwan. She did just that. And so in the years since, what Taiwan has done is phased out its nuclear power. In the 80s, it was generating about half of their power. In the early 2010s, it was still way over 10%. I think it was close to 20%. It's now down to 8% as Tsai Ing-wen has phased it out. And this year, William Lai, now entering into the presidential palace this week, he has maintained that commitment to phasing out nuclear. And nuclear will be fully off of the grid by the end of 2025 in Taiwan. And the good thing, however, is that because the DPP has these environmental credentials, I think that they are best positioned to really flip things around. If the KMT were to continue advocating for nuclear, or it would remain bound up in these contentious politics. But William Lai has a chance to say, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a potential energy crisis where our imports of natural gas, now the dominant fuel, could be stopped by China at any point in time. If China wants, they can institute a blockade. And if not for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Taiwan's not going to be able to get any new energy onto the island. Nuclear, on the other hand, can be maintained in place for an extended period of time. Natural gas requires constant imports because Taiwan's an island. They don't generate their own natural gas. Nuclear also requires imports, but it can be held on site for at least a year and a half at a time. So in this horrible scenario that we all fear of China making a move on Taiwan, nuclear would give them a better chance of maintaining at least some semblance of economic productivity. Certainly wouldn't be able to export the chips like they do now if they faced a blockade, but at least they'd be able to keep something going for the sustenance of the island itself.
And I think you mentioned in your article that Taiwan, there's a very large population there. They have trouble meeting their power needs as it is. I think you mentioned there are blackouts and brownouts as the grid tries to keep up with the need for that vibrant economy. Correct.
And the idea that wind and solar are going to replace nuclear has proven false everywhere it's been tried. And it's been disastrous thus far in Taiwan. In recent years, the costs for building offshore wind have skyrocketed as global economic conditions have changed. And so some of the projections about when these offshore wind farms would come online, they've proven to be out of the question. And so we're phasing out nuclear. We're not really replacing it. And so you've got an energy crunch. And there have been these sequences of blackouts across the island, which can disrupt the production of the important industrial goods that are made there. And that, of course, redounds in the global economy and to the U.S. So there is an ongoing discussion here. There have been a series of referenda on whether nuclear will be continued. And I think it's clear that there's a political opportunity for William Lai to say the context has changed. We now know nuclear is safe. We know that we face threats that make it more important that we keep this online. They need to keep those nuclear plants going.
Fascinating topic. Now you've got my curiosity piqued. I'm going to be keeping a closer eye on this. I mean, other than the threat from China, though, would you say Taiwan is in a fairly stable place politically?
It's a vibrant democracy. There's a lot of contentious politics. There was even a physical scuffle in what they call the legislative UN the other day. But this is a solid democracy. It is a vibrant political system, and it is very, very stable.
Again, we are talking with Jordan McGillis. Jordan, for people who would like to follow your work or connect up with you on social media, what's the best way to do that?
You can check out City Journal at cityjournal.com. Global Taiwan Institute is globaltaiwan.org.
All right. Thank you so much. I hope we talk again soon.
Thank you.
Welcome back. This is our third segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. I want to welcome Young Voices contributor by the name of Samuel Underhill. Sam, this isn't actually your first time on the program, but for the sake of those meeting you for the first time, take a second, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a student at the University of Alabama right now. Also, my main work is the executive director of the Activate Gen Z project. We're a nonprofit that works to get youth more involved in politics, internships, just anything that's civically related, as well as just getting, American youth more informed, registered to vote, just good stuff like that. It's a little bit conflictual for me as a conservative that has, libertarian leanings, but my motto has always been just inform people and then let them decide for themselves. So it's just been a good way for me to kind of help my fellow peers get involved in politics, civics, which I find to be a big passion.
Well, I'm looking at an article that you wrote for realclearpolitics.com. Dear conservatives, we don't need to fear mail-in ballots. Ooh, that's a sore spot for some conservatives. I mean, I've seen a lot of people get really upset at the prospect of mail-in ballots. Why, first of all, why is there the misgiving? Does this have to do with some of the backlash of the 2020 election and questions that people have had about that?
Yeah, so I think to look at why conservatives and the GOP party in general, fears mail-in ballots, hates mail-in ballots, whatever you want to call it, you have to look at kind of starting in 2016, first of all, when Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton both denied the election results, essentially. But then going into 2020, 7 months before the election, Donald Trump was claiming that the mail-in ballots were going to be rigged, claiming that mail-in ballots were going to be thrown away if they had Trump ballot names on them. So I think it was a buildup to the election. It was a conscious buildup by Trump, knowing that he was likely to lose the election. Trump's never been a big fan of losing. He denied the Emmy results in 2011 when he lost on The Apprentice. He denied in 2016 that he lost the popular vote by 2.8 million votes because he claimed that there were 3 million illegal votes in the process with no evidence at all. He denied that he lost Minnesota in 2020, even though he lost it by 7.2%. So it's definitely got a lot to do with Trump's personality. But I also think that it had a lot to do with the COVID pandemic. A lot of Republicans were, kind of reeling from COVID. They were already leaning into theories that pin Democrats as, being to blame for COVID, whether it be the China lab theory, which, ironically has been seen as true at this point, or, anything else related to masks or gloves or stuff like that. So I think there was a lot of fear surrounding that. And that was a great bed for Trump to lay his theories into and kind of sow distrust in the election.
Okay, so where are we as far as are mail-in ballots still, are they seen as an acceptable? Are people still pushing for them as we approach the 2024 general election?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, the Republican Party is attempting to do an about-face, kind of in the face of Trump at this point. Laura Trump, for example, 2 months ago, the first thing she did when she became the party's co-chair was she went on NBC News and she said, hey, I actually think that we shouldn't fear mail-in ballots. We should use mail-in ballots to our advantage. I agree with her. Her only problem is she also still denies the results of the 2020 election, which was propagated on mail-in ballots being, invalid and easy to become fraudulent. So I think a good example of the Republican tone shift and how that needs to change is looking at Elise Stefanik, who is, one of Trump's top potential running mates at this point. But she wasn't always a Trump fan. And when she wasn't a Trump fan in 2016, when Trump made his claims of illegal votes in 2016, she said no. She said, I won my primary election. I won my general election. I know these local people that are counting these votes. They're not committing fraud. No fraud is being committed in American elections. We have the most secure elections. And then, of course, 8 years later, she says, 2020 was the greatest conspiracy of all time. Does a complete about-face just to appease Trump. So I think the party as a whole is going in the right direction. I think the country as a whole trusts mail-in ballots, especially, independents and moderates, which Trump needs to win. So I think as a whole, the party is moving in the right direction. And Laura Trump is trying her best, trying to reconcile the two. But as a conservative, it hurts because in 2020, for example, Democrats, voted 58% early in mail-in, and Republicans only voted 32%. Now you can say, all the Republicans that didn't vote mail-in, voted on election day, but we know that's not true. We know some of them probably got distracted, had other things going on election day and weren't able to get to the polls. So if you take into consideration that Donald Trump lost the Electoral College in 2020 by 44,000 votes as his narrowest path to victory, that's a pretty big swing. 20% of the Republican voters not being able to use mail-in balloting for fear of, distrust in the elections. That's a pretty big swing. So I think it's important. I think we're moving in the right direction, but I also think that the Republican Party needs to acknowledge first and foremost that 2020 was legitimate before we can move to anything else.
Now, I got to admit, I still have questions about it. I don't know that the election was tampered with, but to me, there are still some questions that remain unconvincingly answered. And I don't know what it would take to, dispel the unease that I feel. And I'll just give you an example. One of the things that to me seems suspicious was the swing states that all stopped counting ballots at the exact same time and then resumed at the same time. And look, now suddenly there's this clear advantage where there wasn't going into that. And I'm not looking for somebody to rule me. I don't think Trump is the answer to everybody's political problems, but for me there's still some doubts that remain.
Sure. I think a good place to start with that is where a lot of these doubts, and maybe not for you, but for a lot of conservatives, a lot of these doubts come from, expose documentaries like those of James O'Keefe or those of 2000 Mules, which is a documentary propagated by Dinesh D'Souza, who's a conservative filmmaker that's pretty popular on the right. So just to dive into 2000 Mules a little bit more specifically, 2000 Mules was propagated as this great expose that was going to show all this video evidence of mail-in fraud at all of these ballot boxes of people, in Georgia particularly and in Philadelphia, stuffing ballot boxes and just having all these illegitimate mail-in votes be for Biden. What the film actually ended up showing, despite what Dinesh D'Souza claims, is not a single provable instance of voter fraud. They have all of the security from all of the mail-in, ballot locations. We're not able to show a single instance in the entire film. The film is 2 hours long. They have all of these evidence of quote unquote mules stuffing ballot boxes. They were not able to show a single instance of a person coming to either the same ballot box or another ballot box twice. Every single person that they showed only came to a ballot box once, and though they claimed that these people came to the ballot boxes over 10 times each, they were not able to show a single security video of a person coming to a ballot box more than once. On top of that, what they used as evidence of, cover up for voter fraud or whatever, was gloves and masks and, all these things that you would expect during a pandemic. All these people are dropping off ballots for their friends and family that don't want to go out in public during a pandemic. So when you have people wearing gloves, dropping off ballots. By the way, they investigated some of these people. Brad Raffensperger, who's a Republican Secretary of State in Georgia, investigated a few of these claims that, had been submitted to him and were like the most quote unquote suspicious. And all of them came back as, they were just dropping off the ballots legitimately for their family and friends. So personally, I don't put much stake in election fraud claims. I think since, the end of the Civil War, when 1876, when Rutherford B. Hayes, overturned the Electoral College, there always have been claims of illegitimacy, but I don't think any of them hold water in the end.
Is there anything that could be done in terms of transparency that would answer those concerns that remain. And I'm not even talking about outright, you know, the election was stolen, but just people who say,
sure,
I just don't know if I can trust it. There, you know, the questions have been raised.
Yes.
I don't know if they've been sufficiently answered. How might they be more transparent?
Yeah, so as a conservative, I'm still a big proponent of voter ID, and I say this in the article. I don't think that there's anything wrong with asking people to identify themselves or asking people to verify their citizenship, which is why, even though I don't agree with the reasons behind the SAVE Act, which is a bill that's proposed by Mike Lee in the Senate right now, which would require at the federal level people verifying their citizenship to be able to cast a mail-in ballot or be able to vote at all. I don't think that's a bad idea. I think that's very common sense. But at the same time, you know, we don't have to have maximum security facilities to know that these elections are secure. For example, there was a study that came out in Arizona. I'm not saying that there's not a single fraudulent ballot in the entire country, but there was a study that came out in Arizona. Even the most liberal conclusion from this, sensationalist study said that at maximum, there were maybe 200 to 300 fraudulent ballots in Arizona. Arizona was decided by 10 to 11,000 votes, and Donald Trump still claims that he won the state. So I just don't think that, I think we have to recognize that, yes, there are problems in the election, but they're not even close to having decided an election at this point.
It sounds like at least part of it's going to be managing our emotions, because it seems like these elections get more emotionally volatile every single year. And frankly, sure, I'm not that desperate for somebody to rule me, but then again, some people do get pretty caught up. Again, we're talking with Sam Underhill. Sam, for people who want to follow you or find you on social media, how do they do that?
Yeah, sure. So I have a Twitter profile. It's at Sam Underhill _, and you can also check out Activate Gen Z's website at activategenz.org.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment today. We're happy to welcome David Mendoza back to the program. David is a Young Voices contributor, and I'm sure there are people meeting you for the first time. Take a moment. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you for having me again. I'm currently teaching history and social sciences in Sacramento, California. I've completed a master's degree in historical theology recently at Westminster Seminary in California. Really interested in history, really interested in ideas and how they interact with politics and economics. So yeah, no, thank you again for having me.
So I have to ask, how have things been on your school's campus? Have things been pretty tame? It's been kind of a wild spring for a lot of campuses.
Yeah, things have been pretty good over here. I teach high school, so there's nothing really crazy about my students, at least right now. But I know that Sacramento State has had actually their own encampment recently. So thankfully, we're not as active as certain other schools in California, including UCLA, which recently had their own encampment. So it's a little more tame out here, which is kind of nice.
Well, I'm looking at an article that you wrote for International Policy Digest about how colleges became incubators for anti-Semitism. And, there was a time when I'd kind of roll my eyes a little bit. Okay, anti-Semitism, there have always been people who, feel that Jews are responsible for this or for that. But it's been pretty easy to roll our eyes at that. But we're seeing some pretty unadulterated hatred coming out on some of these protests, to the point, colleges are canceling their graduation ceremonies. Where do we begin to unpack what has been happening on these college campuses, and why does it lead so strongly in the direction of like real deal anti-Semitism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you. There's two things that I point to in the piece. One of them is I really noticed when hearing a lot of these protests and the commentators that have been talking about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, for instance, right now, which I do try to avoid a little bit in the piece, because I think that I think there is a way to keep that separate than what's happening on college campuses. I think that the protesters are largely trying to sort of lump in the Jews with the Israeli government, and I don't think that's necessarily fair. But I do think that when I would hear a lot of the protesters and commentators talking about this, they were engaging in a lot of rhetoric that I noticed sounded a lot like what Jonathan Haidt had written about in The Cloud in the American Mind. And he talks about that college campuses have gone they're overly represented by left-wing politics, and they have a sort of just a distorted understanding of justice and engage in what he calls cognitive distortions, which basically allows students to engage in us versus them thinking. And there's a lot of reductionism that they kind of have as far as they don't take into account the voices or other opinions that they don't share as having any sort of credibility. They feel that there's a justification to sort of stamp out any sort of opposition to their ideas. And we saw this actually with the Evergreen State University with Brett Weinstein, sorry, where he was actually targeted by students in 2019, I believe, or 2017. And actually, the students themselves actually even took the college president hostage, essentially, because they believed that they were opposing their mission, basically, to purge racism, anti-transgenderism or what have you, from the college. And so there's a similar type of mentality that I think has just been brewing along racial and even just the sexual revolution thinking, or the gender identity thinking. And I think that this is sort of just the next wave of that, because the Palestinians are sort of viewed by a lot of college protesters as sort of this oppressed group that is deserving of protection. Never mind that Jewish people as a whole globally have also been the receivers of oppression and hatred and discrimination, but they're just sort of choosing not to see it that way. The other part of it has to do with sort of Black-Jewish relations in general, I think. This actually has more to do with the political leanings of the institutions themselves. We've seen sort of a rise in tensions between Black Americans and Jewish Americans for a number of reasons, but I think that certain ideas have become adopted and mainstreamed by a lot of people on the left at university campuses that read people like James Baldwin and sort of see him as like, he can't be criticized on any of his ideas. And I don't necessarily have something against James Baldwin, but he did write an essay in the 1960s in the New York Times where he said some pretty what we would call anti-Semitic remarks about Jewish Americans. And I think that his sentiments, as well as those in groups like the Nation of Islam or the Black Hebrew Israelites that have been deemed as sort of fringe or outlandish movements, are kind of becoming more tolerated on certain ideas that they hold about Jewish Americans. And I don't really think that progressives have very good categories for how to sort through those things. Instead, they sort of just adopt it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, one of the more telling interviews that I saw in the last few weeks was a young woman, I believe this was at Columbia University, where she was being asked, why are you protesting? And she was honest enough to say, I don't really know. And I thought, I'm not trying to say, boy, she's just so stupid. She was obviously caught up, in the fervor of, there's a cause here and I'm going to rally behind it because I think it's a righteous cause. But she couldn't even articulate what it was. And that makes me wonder how many of those protesters have just kind of been co-opted by people who do have an agenda, but maybe it's not necessarily, what they claim that agenda is. In other words, it may not necessarily be about free Palestine. It might be for just creating unrest.
Yeah, I've seen a number of takes actually talking about that. Carl Truman, professor at Grove City College, actually wrote a piece recently for First Things saying that, a lot of these protesters aren't really unified in their thinking about what is it that they're trying to construct. They're more so just trying to cause destruction. They're trying to tear down anything that they see as part of an oppressive system. And there's been a lot of reports of people that don't know it necessarily why they're at these encampments. And even when you ask them about Jewish history in Israel, a lot of them are actually unfamiliar with the Jews having lived in Israel for thousands of years, even going back to the ancient world, before Rome even. And so that's just kind of a story that seems a little inconvenient for some who have an agenda, but it's also a story that is not as familiar for a lot of the protesters who are they're admittedly young people, and I think that young people do have a tendency to get caught up in things. So I think that's true.
So what can the universities do in helping to look? It's good to be young and idealistic. We've all been there, and hopefully we still have some degree of idealism of, there's the way the world is and there's the way it could be, and we're working to try to bring those two visions together. But how can we do it in a way that's productive and doesn't rest on either disrupting or destroying?
Yeah, I think that universities should have no tolerance policies for any sort of anti-Semitic rhetoric or harassment or targeting. And that doesn't just go for Jewish Americans, but that just goes for anybody for any reason. One of the things that was pretty shocking for, I think, most of the country was when those three university presidents were hauled before Congress and couldn't really give a good answer on, does calls for Jewish genocide violate your codes of conduct? I think that was more representative of the breakdown of basically the adults running the university systems. I think that universities can have a no tolerance policy for that type of rhetoric or that type of action and harassment, but they also need to get back to teaching young people virtue and ethical living, which I really do think is so lost now that we're seeing the results of people who aren't given a good, robust understanding in how to live well in society, especially in a pluralistic society, and what constitutes the good to strive for, and how do you show that with your fellow Americans and your fellow college students.
We got a little less than a minute, but I have to ask, is there anybody you see out there who's doing it right in terms of how they are addressing campus protests? Are there any people in leadership that you would point to and say maybe they have a better approach here?
I can't think of any right now, actually. I can think of individual voices who have spoken out about it. I know that there are a number of faculty at Stanford that have been vocal about their opposition to a lot of the encampments that have led to anti-Semitism. There's been some even at the UCLA campus, including Leo Hanian, who's been outspoken about it. But the common thread is that you see them also asking administrators to take it more seriously and asking themselves, okay, where are the adults in the room?
Okay, again, we are talking with David Mendoza. He is a Young Voices contributor. David, for people who would like to follow you on social media, what's the best way to go about that?
You can find me on Twitter at DAMendoza62. That's my primary way that you can find me.
All right, great to visit with you. Thank you.
Thank you.